right, so here's the second part of your notes. We are still going to be solving quadratics, and this time we're going to be factoring them. What we have to do first is set them up for ourselves by reading the word problem. So this first kind of problem we're doing in number 6, go ahead and take a second and just read that sentence to yourself. There's a lot going on in that sentence, so let's break it down for a minute before we set up our equation. The first thing is this. When we say product of something, that means to do what? Multiply, right? We're going to be multiplying some stuff. We're going to multiply 2 consecutive, negative, even integers. So let's talk about what all those words mean. Consecutive means one after another. So if I'm counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so forth, 2 and 1 are consecutive because they're right after each other. 5 and 6 are consecutive because they're right after each other. All right. But this problem is saying we want consecutive negative numbers. So that would be like -1, -3, -1 and -2, -5 and -6. But this means even. This is asking me for even integers. So we talked about integers earlier in the year. They're whole numbers that are positive or negative, so no fractions, but even ones. So we want even integers. That means they come right after each other that are negative. So -4 and -6 is an example, -8 and -10, -12. What would be consecutive negative even integers? If I told you -12, what 2 answers would be consecutive with -12? -10 would, right? Because it comes right before. But you also might have thought of -14 because it comes next. So this is what we're trying to find in this problem. 2 consecutive negative even integers whose product is 48. That means when you multiply them together, you get 48. Now we don't know what they are. So when we don't know something, we use a variable. So I want you to read part A to yourself and think about what it's asking you to find. It says write an equation that would be used to find x, the smaller number. So we don't know what that is, right? So x is going to stand for the smaller number. Well, we need to come up with an expression to represent the other number. I'm looking for two numbers. How do you get from an even number to the next even number? Like if I gave you the even number 4, and I said, what's the next even number? What would you tell me? You would say 6, right? Mathematically, how do you go from 4 to 6? Mathematically, what do? You add 2. So to get to any next even number, you add 2 to the one you already had. In equation form, that looks like this. If x equals the smaller number, how do you go from there to the next even number? You add 2. Okay, so that's the other number. And what are we going to do with those two things? What did that word product mean? It means to multiply them, right? So I'm going to multiply those, x and times x plus 2. But it doesn't look like this. If I only have that dot there between the two x's, that means I'm only doing x times x. I need x times all of x plus 2, so I have to put parentheses there. And I know that when I multiply those, it's going to equal 48. So that's all part A is asking us to do, is to write the equation. You could stop here, or you could, for a second form of the answer, both of these would be correct. You could distribute that x through, and you could write x squared plus 2x equals 48. Right? Or for even one more correct answer, you could subtract 48 from both sides and have this. I would take all of those three answers right there. So that's the part A, setting up your equation. Part B says, what are the two integers? And I hope when you solve this form, this third form that I gave you as an option, looking at that, your brain should be firing at you that you can factor and solve that using your cross method. So that's what we're going to do next. So I need to know what two factors multiply to negative 48 and add to positive 2. So pause your video and figure that out for a second. All right, hopefully you came up with 8 and negative 6. So I'm going to factor that equation by grouping, and I will rewrite the middle term using 8 and negative 6. Or if you like swing method, you can do that now, or any other shortcut, as long as it gets you the right answer. I'm just going to do this grouping method for people who like to see that. So group. The first group has x in common. The second group has negative 6 in common. And when you divide that out, that leaves you x plus 8. And now these two groups have x plus 8 in common with x minus 6 left over. And now that I have two factors equal to 0, I break them up and set them equal to 0 separately. And solve those, and I get x equals negative 8 and x equals 6. One of those cannot be the answer. I want you to pause and think about which one cannot be. Hopefully you came up with the 6, right? It cannot be 6 because the original problem asked us to find negative even integers. So it can only be the negative 8. But it asked us to find two problems, or two numbers. So yes, negative 8 is one of them. But how do we find the second one? What did we talk about way over here? See where I'm highlighting in the purple right here? X is the smaller number, which we found is negative 8. How do I find the other number? The x plus 2. I now know that x is negative 8. And when you do negative 8 plus 2, you get negative 6. So these are two consecutive even integers that multiply to 48. Right, so let's look at this. Take a minute and read the next problem to yourself. So we had this square on the left where the sides are the same. They're both x and x, right? Because it's a square. But then the length of one of the sides was increased by 4. And so now we have this rectangle. It's a rectangle now because the sides are different, are no longer all the same. And we know that for this new rectangle, the area is 32 square inches. Determine the original length of the rectangle. X is the original length. So it's basically, this is the same thing as asking me to find x. Right? So I've got these two sides, x and x plus 4. How does that information relate to each other? Well, I also know that the area is 32. So area means you take these two things and multiply them together. And just like in the last problem, it does not look like this. X times x plus 4 equals 32, with just that dot in the middle. With just that dot, you're only multiplying the x's, but you need x times all of x plus 4. So you write it like that, right? So there's your expression. And from here, it works just like the last problem. In fact, I encourage you to pause your video and try and finish this out by yourself before you watch me do it. What I'm going to do is distribute the x here. That gives me x squared plus 4x. And then I also need to move the 32 over to the left by subtracting it to both sides. And that gives me 0. Now I am going to factor by grouping. I need to know what multiplies to negative 32 and adds to 4. And that's 8 and negative 4. So I rewrite the middle term with a positive 8x and a negative 4x. I do my grouping. The first group has an x in common. The second one has a negative 4, leaving me x plus 8. And then they have an x plus 8 in common. You set each of those equal to 0 to solve. And that gives you, when you solve, positive 4 and negative 8. Now, just like in the last problem, one of these cannot work. And I want you to think about why for a second. It's the negative 8, right? Measurement, actual physical length cannot be negative. So it's only got one answer, and that is 4. Be sure to write your units on here. It's 4 inches. Take a moment, pause your video, and I want you to read the last problem and just think about what it's telling you. Okay, here we go. Let's sort of break this equation, this function down for a second. So we have h of t equals negative 16t squared plus 64t plus 260. Here's what we're trying to find. After how many seconds will the ball be 24 feet above the ground? It was thrown directly upward from a balcony that is 216 feet in the air. So this piece right here, this h of t, represents the height based on a certain amount of time that has passed. So if it was 5 seconds later, where would the ball be? What would its height be? You would figure that out by plugging 5 in for all the t's, and that would give you your height. But we don't know what the t's are, right? We're trying to find the t. So this is opposite of what we did on number 1 on the front of your worksheet. We're really trying to find t, the x value when given y. But in this case, it's t and h. So we know that the height is going to be 24. We need to figure out what the t is, or the time at that height. So instead of plugging in for t, we're plugging in for h of t. We know that it's 24 here. And so the t's will all stay t's. And now we have this quadratic that we need to solve for. We have to get it in standard form first. So we subtract 24 to both sides. And be sure to look at the handwritten notes that I have in your Google Classroom, because along the left-hand side, I explain out all of the steps that we're doing. And then from here, now it feels like we really want to just go ahead and straight start our cross method. But here's why that's not a good idea. 2 reasons. The first reason is because there's a negative on the a value. All right. We need to at least divide that negative out of everything before we can factor. Factoring does not work well if you leave that negative out front. The second thing we have to take care of is that each of these things have a GCF. I want you to pause the video and play with your calculator or do some trial and error by hand and try and figure out the biggest factor that they all have in common. Like, for example, 2, they're all even, so you can divide 2 out of all of them. You can also divide 4 out of all of them, but there's an even bigger number that I want you to pause and figure out. Hopefully you came up with 16, okay? So what we're going to do is divide that out of both sides. Divide everything by -16. And then on the left, you still have 0, because 0 divided by anything is still 0. And on the right, we now have positive t squared minus 4t minus 12. And now that the a value is positive, we can do our cross method. And as a bonus, because we divided out a GCF, the numbers are way smaller to work with. They would have been much bigger, and it would have been a harder problem if we hadn't taken that GCF out a second ago with the 16. All right, so now we can do our cross method. What multiplies to -12 and adds to -4 is -6 and 2. So I will rewrite the middle term with those two numbers. Grouping next. The first group has a t in common, so I have t minus 6. The second group has a 2 in common, leaving me t minus 6. Now the two groups have t minus 6 in common, leaving me t plus 2. You set each of those factors equal to 0 and solve them, and you get t equals 6 and t equals -2. Which one of those is a false solution or an unreasonable solution? It doesn't work for the problem. The -2, right? Because time can't be negative. So your final answer is 6 seconds. All right. So now go do your practice problems and look at my solutions in the Google Classroom. And then after that, do your extra practice problems, check with the key, and it's the extra practice worksheet that I want you to upload a picture of into your Google Classroom.